I was walking around the rooftops with Aerith when suddenly something hit me. Suddenly, I realized I wasn't just playing a video game. Suddenly, I wasn't just a gamer. I was transported into this world, into a moment where I was engulfed by the somber moment between these two characters. I wasn't killing enemies. I wasn't being strategic in the use of the amazing combat system that exists in this game. I wasn't rushing through the game to get to the end point as quickly as possible. The game didn't let me. The game wanted me to take this moment in, a moment that resonated with me in a way only few games can, and transported me back to my teen years. But it was only recently that I truly realized how much gaming meant to me. That made me understand something about myself, that I wouldn't be the person who I am today without them. Because there are moments in gaming that stick with you, and later in life, you look back at those times and you realize that those moments were larger than life. That is the power of video games. Just like Final Fantasy VII Remake is able to demonstrate in this rooftop scene. It was such a surreal experience, not just because of what I was feeling in this moment, but how it reminded me of my favorite moment in gaming. So, without further ado, let's talk about how I got to play Final Fantasy VII Remake. At a time in my life when I was studying abroad and having my PlayStation 3 encounter the infamous yellow lights of death, video games became almost non-existent for me. But in 2015, Sony announced that their E3 press conference would break the internet. And that it did. Around midway through its conference, an enigmatic trailer was shown that implied heavily that this could possibly be related to Final Fantasy VII. However, many fans had difficulty believing it.
Midgar looks exactly like that! What are you doing?
This isn't it.
There had been so many years when fans thought that they were already getting a remake of the original Final Fantasy VII, a game that came out in 1997 for the PlayStation 1, a game that is considered by many to be one of the greatest games of all time, a game that pushed the RPG genre, graphics and storytelling in a way that games really hadn't yet done before, at least not to that level. A game that is beloved to those who played it at the time or experienced it years later, as it happened with me. And then in 2005, a tech demo for the PlayStation 3 was released by Square that showcased the opening of Final Fantasy VII in next-gen graphics. At the time, many people like myself thought that we were getting a remake for the PlayStation 3, but it was confirmed later that it was in fact merely a tech demo to showcase the capabilities of the PlayStation 3 hardware and the new engine that Square was going to use for future games. Fast forward into December of 2014, a year after the PlayStation 4 was released, and Square came out during the PlayStation Experience conference to talk about Final Fantasy VII. The crowd went wild. Was this it? Were we finally getting the remake we so desperately wanted? The answer was no. It was just a port of the original game for the PS4. There was such hype during that moment, and instantly the whole gaming world felt deflated. So it comes as no surprise that around half a year later, when everyone was witnessing what seemed to finally be what the fans always wanted, no one really believed it.
Don't be a movie now.
We wanted to believe, but we just couldn't. We were burned so many times and we didn't want to be disappointed again. It took until the last moment of the trailer when the word remake was shown that the fans really went wild, including myself. I wasn't playing games at the time, but I was just as excited as everyone else. It was amazing to finally get confirmation that the remake of a game we had been wanting for 18 years was finally coming. But it would only really come to fruition 5 years later. In April of 2020, the game was finally released. The music, the graphics, the execution of how the camera would fly from the big city to the train station, how it mirrored the old game but also managed to elevate the cinematic experience by showing a glimpse of Cloud on the train before his eventual reveal, by showing up close Biggs, Jesse and Wedge in action, by showing Barrett walk and turn to Cloud, and then finally seeing Cloud jump from the train to the platform, and the camera moves forward to a close-up of his face, finally revealing Cloud properly, and then the camera seamlessly moves and turns behind him, and the game is ready to play. This is how Final Fantasy VII Remake begins. And by this point, I wasn't someone who was studying abroad with no console. In 2016, I bought a PlayStation 4. I played through all of these games and more. And here I was, playing Final Fantasy VII Remake as a gamer, just like I used to during my teen years. And what struck me the most was the linearity of the game. Throughout the past few years, games have really tried to open up its sense of scale, to give you the feeling that you can go everywhere, that you see a mountain that's not only in the distance, but if you approach it, you will eventually get there. To have literally a world that is your playground and the game lets you explore it. Red Dead Redemption 2, for instance, makes each section of the map feel very different from each other. Being in Valentine is a different experience to being in Rhodes, and certainly extremely different from the overwhelming sensation that is being in Saint Denis. More than that, it doesn't clutter your map with side quests, so you never feel overwhelmed with things you need to do. You either explore and find new things to do, or you just follow the main course of the game, giving the player a sense of freedom. But other open world games normally don't do that. Despite some being amazing with its direction, I always find it overwhelming. Because while I'm always more interested in the main story of the game, if I know there's so many side quests to do, then I feel almost obligated to do them because I know they are there. While a linear game focuses more on the story and always makes you feel that everything you do is important and necessary. Like God of War, which proved that you can do linear games properly, even if it wasn't entirely linear. But it was only in 2019 that I really got to feel the brilliance of linear games again, thanks to the remake of Resident Evil 2. And boy oh boy, was it everything I wanted. It was able to capture the essence of old style video games like the original game did, but also adapt it into a more modern age. And the game never stopped. It was the first game in a very long time that reminded me of what old games were able to do. And I think Final Fantasy VII Remake pushed that aspect even further. Since the game only covered the Midgar section of the original game, it meant it would have to be linear, and that linearity is something I was not expecting. Let's take for instance the beginning section of the game. It starts with you looking towards the Mako reactor, a place that is shown to you in the background design of the game. And the more you approach it, the more it makes a point in showing that you're nearing it. Now while the original game did certainly do this, the remake goes even further, not just showing the Mako reactor when you're going in, but also witnessing the massive consequences of the bombing after it happens. In chapter 2, you see people in the streets totally affected by this, by a terrorist attack that ended up being way more significant than our main characters realized it would be. And the fact that you see the destruction of the Mako reactor in the background is constantly reminding you of what is going on. This attention to detail by its developers to give you a sense of immersion in not only where you are, but also what is going on, is everything. It gives you the feeling that everything you do or are about to do is massively important and affects everything around you, from its foreground to the background. For example, there is another point later in the game when you're leaving the train graveyard section, you notice that you're getting closer to Sector 7 because it's a location you have seen before. But as you're going along, you suddenly see some explosions happening in the background, and the game doesn't immediately focus on it. You need to get closer to it until the characters finally realize what is going on. Everything that is happening in the background is there to do two things: to remind us of the world we're in, but also that it's essential to the story that we're constantly going through. And this makes it feel that the world you're in is very much alive, which proves that you don't need to have an open world game to feel like you're in a much bigger world, precisely due to how its game design is so intricate to the storytelling aspect of the game, and just gives you a sense of wonder. Another example is when you get to chapter 3. You have just escaped from the soldiers that were pursuing you after the immediate aftermath of the bombing mission, and you arrive at the Sector 7 slums. And once you step out of the train, you stop for a moment and realize the scale of this world, of this massive city. It's here where you finally get to look at Midgar properly for the very first time, and you feel engulfed by it. It's beautiful to look at, but also has this eerie feeling that you can't let go of. And the music that you're listening to is so important to enhance that experience. That beautifully encompasses the emotions you're going through by just being in this world. Not just because these are new renditions of the music and themes used in the original game, but because the music is just simply that good. It's not afraid to be in your face. It's not afraid to make you feel. And it does such an incredible job at that. Walking through the Sector 7 slums, listening to people naturally talk around you, having Seventh Heaven in the background, seeing someone sat on the stairs, and meeting Tifa for the first time in this game. This moment, in the beginning of chapter 3, is when you know that you're going through something really special. Which is why when we get to meet Aerith for the second time, this feeling is suddenly elevated even more. And for that, we need to talk about how they met for the first time. During your escape of the bombing mission, you go through the cinematic sequence that is different from the original game that throws you off completely. And shortly afterwards, you meet this weird flower girl who notices something that is wrong with you. And the first thing she says is,
"Are you okay?"
But quickly after, you're separated from her. It's just a short moment as it happened in the original game, but with an added layer to it. And you get a glimpse of a character who is crucial for the overall narrative of the game. But as many of us know, it would take quite a while to meet her again. After going through chapters where it was mostly focused on its incredible combat and moving forward as quickly as you can, culminating in the amazing boss fight against the Airbuster, you fall from the upper plate and you go through this weird dream sequence only to hear a voice you've possibly heard before.
Hey, who?
Leading you to then wake up and you see up close this flower girl again, who goes by the name of Aerith. And the first line that she says here is,
"Maybe you're not okay."
which perfectly contrasts with the first thing she says to Cloud in the first meeting they had earlier in the game. Just the juxtaposition of these two lines perfectly shows how much time, thought, and effort was put into this remake. From its writing to its design, to perfectly encapsulate all of the perfect moments that exist in this game, not just in recreating one-to-one what the original did, but also enhancing these moments. Because the more you play the remake, the more you know it's self-aware of the importance of the original. And so having Cloud for a moment not only talk to Aerith, but also foreshadow certain events that happen later in the game is brilliant. Especially because it uses Cloud as a narrative device for that, which makes complete sense considering how he is used in the original game. Just this foreshadowing hits you really hard and makes you instantly connect with Aerith that much more. It's top tier storytelling. But this moment extends even further. And it's here where we arrive at the beginning of this video. After evading Reno and his men, both Cloud and Aerith escape through the rooftops. You step out and the light blinds you for a second, until it shows you the beautiful scenery that you're in. You look around and you see how everything has so many layers to it. You're looking at the rooftops that you're about to go through. You look up and see the top of the plate that you just fell from. And you're taking all of this in with a girl who wants to poke fun at you, but also wants to slowly tear the wall that Cloud has around him. A piano being played almost in loop until it eventually turns into Aerith's theme. Just like the original did, but in a way that resonated with me even more. You're getting to know Aerith in a way you never really were able to before.
Looked like you knew each other.
Maybe he thought I could be the greatest soldier yet.
Forget it.
You mad?
And it's slowly making Cloud more vulnerable, thanks to her captivating personality, but also through the execution of so many things happening at once. Even something as small as doves flying once you approach them truly captures this heartfelt moment. It's pure magic. To have the game slow down so much right after such a fast-paced sequence makes you appreciate this moment even more. And to perfectly cap this moment is right at the end of the set piece where Aerith trips and falls into Cloud's arms and Aerith says jokingly,
My hero.
which might seem like just a funny moment, but in reality it contrasts beautifully with the moment that happens later in the story of the original game where Cloud also has Aerith in his arms, only not as a hero but as the exact opposite of that. This shows the extreme lengths that the remake has gone to really accentuate a moment like this. A moment that will stick with me for my whole life. And this game does this constantly, as is shown shortly after when you arrive at Aerith's house and you see the beautiful waterfall, green and flowers that surround her house. Another moment that you just take it all in. That really makes you want to stop and let yourself be immersed. Reminding me of the moment when you arrive in Saint Denis in Red Dead Redemption 2. Or the moment when you are able to stroke a giraffe in The Last of Us. Because these are more than just video games. These are experiences that connect with us deeply in a way that only video games can. By creating these perfect moments. Which brings me back to my most perfect moment in any video game ever. And that comes in another Final Fantasy game. Not the original Final Fantasy VII, but one that came out for the PlayStation 2. And that is Final Fantasy X. I remember being 13 and buying this game. Little did I know at the time that this game would have such a profound impact on me. Because within its first hour, I reached the moment that I would constantly go back to throughout my life. What I like to call my happy place, my home. But it's essential that we talk about the events that transpired beforehand. The beginning of the game focuses on a man named Tidus who is famous for playing a sport called blitzball. However, a massive monster known as Sin invades the city and full-on attacks it. Tidus manages to escape, but shortly after is engulfed and sucked in by Sin. Our protagonist then wakes up and finds himself in a different location completely alone. One that feels frightening, one that feels empty, one that feels lost. And what's masterful about this moment is how the game forces you to do something that you only do once the entire game. After Tidus finds a spot to kind of shelter himself, he feels extremely cold, and so you actually have to find certain elements such as flint to create fire. You wander through this isolated place, extremely foggy with no one in sight, just to find some way to warm yourself. And that's exactly what you do. Upon finding the elements, you finally create fire, and for a split second you think, okay, there's a glimpse of hope now. And suddenly, not only does the fire start to burn out, but also a group of people show up out of nowhere, who at first seem like they are there to help you, but in reality have just kidnapped you. And to make matters worse, they speak a completely different language from yours. What's even more ironic is that being with these people makes you feel even more alone than you did before. And that's key to this whole section. Loneliness. Every time Tidus seems to be getting some sort of glimpse of hope, something happens to accentuate how alone he really is. And it's none truer than what happens shortly after. One of these people, who we find out later to be Riku, actually does speak the same language as Tidus. and after doing a few small jobs with them, he seems ecstatic because there is finally someone who he can speak to, someone who understands him, and so feels slightly confident to talk about his situation. Problem is, Riku reveals to Tidus that Sin destroyed Zanarkand 1,000 years ago, and to add even more despair to the situation, Sin shows up again and Tidus is stranded once more. Throughout this first hour, the protagonist goes from doing what he knows best in a city he considers his home to being as far away from it as possible. Not just in space, but in time too. Until we arrive near a beach, an island, on a bright sunny day. Tidus suddenly wakes up, looks up towards the blue sky, and then a blitzball hits his head. A smile shows up on his face, and he immediately does his signature shot and kicks it back to the people on the beach. As Tidus says,
"Finally, things were starting to look up."
Just the fact that there are people who play the same sport as he does gives him a sense of belonging, a sense that he's found a little bit of comfort. And you meet this guy called Waka who will take you through the islands to the town where he and his friends live. Someone who seems to be there for you. And it's here where the moment begins. As soon as you start to go with Waka, a certain track pops up. One that just engulfs you in the uplifting mood that this moment creates. One that just lets you know that despite everything you went through, it's going to be alright. It's a beautiful mix of emotions that just bring a certain mood that can only happen if you've been through a lot in your life. That suddenly brings you home. I remember going through this at the time and feeling so happy. But I would only really understand its significance years later, when I would grow up through my teen years, going through the struggle that me and my family was going through at the time, and how that affected me, feeling like I was completely lost during these years, feeling like I didn't know who I really was. And then suddenly one day, I stumbled upon this track on YouTube. Suddenly, I was brought back to this moment. Suddenly, I was home. I was feeling like Tidus was at this point in the game, and I felt understood and reminded me of my journey through this game. Going through this island with Waka, fighting against enemies, arriving at Besaid, and meeting Yuna for the first time. I remember being so obsessed with this world I was in. It was such a profound moment in my life, and every time I go on with my life, I know there is a time where I will stumble upon this track again and will bring me back to my fondest memory in all of video games, as I did now when making this video. Fast forward 18 years and here I am playing another Final Fantasy game that was giving me similar moments. Not just the rooftop scene mentioned earlier, but many others too. Even a moment as small as the one where Cloud leaves Aerith's house during the night to go back to the Sector 7 slums. Only shortly after, Aerith is there waiting for him. And both walk together at night alongside a track that is just incredibly beautiful too. Having connected deeply with this person, knowing what's going to happen in the future, but in this moment in time, I was there with her, and her positivity, optimistic nature, and captivating personality made this moment magical. And how Masashi Amazu, who was responsible for Final Fantasy X's soundtrack, also had a major hand in composing the remake of Final Fantasy VII. Now of course, there are moments in the game where it does open up a bit more and you do have to do side quests which don't feel as polished as the main story of the game. But it never bothered me, because it's spread out across the game quite nicely. But more importantly, I always felt like I was just connecting with other meaningful characters during these semi-open world sections. And by doing them, you also get more heartfelt scenes with them. Whether it's seeing Tifa enjoy spending time with Cloud, or seeing Aerith able to connect with Cloud and we see him actually care for her. And you don't get to witness these scenes if you don't do all of the side quests, which meant that for the majority of the game, everything felt purposeful and needed. and thus I really felt like I was playing such a special game. From you spending time with Jesse, Biggs and Wedge and getting to know them more, and jumping off the upper plate in beautiful 80s fashion, to the incredible feeling it was letting myself immerse in Wall Market, fighting against the Hell House, getting to witness Cloud's dance routine at the Honeybee Inn, and getting to play as both Aerith and Tifa with this incredible track that mixes beautifully both of their themes, or arriving at Shinra building and choosing to go through the stairs instead of the elevator, and the game making you slow down to emulate the experience you had back in the original game. The numerous epic boss fights and how you had to strategically think about how you were going to defeat them. Or even just the amazing storytelling this game had, with its saddest moments. More specifically, the impact of the Sector 7 plate falling and how this affected so many of its protagonists. Especially Barrett and his emotional reaction to all of this. Hoping that Jesse, Biggs, Wedge and especially Marlene survived this horrible incident. And you walking alongside him, watching him deal with all of this, reminding me of how good Japanese storytelling can be. Not just in video games or in anime, but also in Japanese cinema. And for some reason, reminding me of Kikushio's emotional scene in The Seven Samurai, which shows that an outburst, when done right, isn't over the top, but needed. And I feel Japan are the best at pulling off these scenes. And yes, I just compared Final Fantasy VII Remake with The Seven Samurai. But it's not just Barrett that has difficulty in dealing with this moment in the game. It's all of them, especially with certain scenes that only occur depending on the choices you make. Scenes that can either show Tifa letting all of her emotions out, and you see not only Cloud trying to comfort her, but also he himself finally getting some comfort himself, to the point where he inadvertently holds Tifa so tightly that it ends up hurting her. Scenes that can show you having a dream sequence with Aerith and how she doesn't want you to fall in love with her because she knows what's to happen in the future, and how she doesn't want Cloud to be traumatically affected by it. Or scenes that can show Barrett dealing with what just happened and showing a more optimistic side to him that you would never really seen before, and how you feel he really connects with Cloud during this moment. It doesn't matter which scene you get, because all of them develop each character and thus develops Cloud himself, which shows how really brilliant this game is on so many levels. And there is a very simple explanation for that. Most of the people who worked on this game also worked on the original Final Fantasy VII. I felt that there was the same passion, devotion and nuance put into this remake, by enhancing so many moments of the original, but also wanting to recreate the feeling of going through the original game regarding its uncertainty. The ending opens up the possibility of forging a new path for these characters in the next installments, which is exactly the same feeling we had when playing the original Final Fantasy VII at this point in the game, because the game isn't just a remake of the original, but rather it's remaking our experience of going through it for the first time, which is something I love. It's bold, it's ambitious, but most of all, it's incredibly risky. But as someone who loves to create things, who loves to showcase my passion my way, I have the utmost respect for these creators, for Kitase, Nojima and Nomura, because you can tell they are giving their all in this game. It's not the most polished game of this generation. It's not even the most groundbreaking and realistic game of this generation. But it's the one that gave me everything I needed, because it has some of the most perfect moments I've ever gone through in a video game, like I went through with Final Fantasy X so long ago.